Welcome everybody. We'll get started. Okay. So obviously we find ourselves in a very special and important time of year on the Jewish calendar. We're just a few days before Pesach. I do want to ask everybody if you could mute yourself, because I don't know if I can mute anybody else. But if you can mute yourself this way, unless you have a question, obviously. But otherwise, so we shouldn't have to be disturbed by any sounds in the background. So if you could please mute yourself. Okay. Now, so obviously Pesach being this coming.
Honey, don't touch.
Touching you, please mute us.
Let me see if I could do. I don't know. It's hard for me to see all the controls, but I think okay.
It's way on the left side, in the bottom.
Yeah. Okay. So Pesach being obviously the first night of the Seder, Wednesday night, April 8th. Second night of the second Seder night, Thursday night, April 9th. And obviously Pesach being a time with so many beautiful mitzvahs, so many beautiful minhagim, traditions, customs, and so on, and which bring along very beautiful memories. The time before Pesach brings its own special memories. Obviously in Jewish homes around the world, the time before Pesach being spent to get rid of any chametz, rubbing, scrubbing, cleaning, washing, rinsing, and everything. Today, I would like to visit Pesach from the perspective of Chassidus with some stories and I think very meaningful teachings, and if I could add, especially in our time today. Now, to begin the learning of the perspective of Chassidus on Pesach, I want to start with a fascinating question that the Maharal of Prague asks. The Maharal of Prague, his birthday actually is on Pesach. It's a famous story that his birth prevented a blood libel. That's a story in and of itself. And he asks like this. He says, seemingly, why do we celebrate Pesach nowadays? He says, seemingly, this is his question. Tisha B'Av should cancel out Pesach. You see, if Pesach made us free people, so the Maharal asks, Tisha B'Av is when we were sent again into exile. Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. The definition of exile, the definition of galus is that we shibud malchus, to quote the terms from the Gemara and from Chazal, we are under the rules of malchus, of the nations, of the governments, and in that case, we're sort of back in Mitzrayim. That's the question Maharal asks. He says, why do we celebrate Pesach if Tisha B'Av should cancel out Pesach? That's his question. Now, to appreciate his answer, here's where I want to get into the Chassidic understanding of Pesach. They tell a story of a Jew who once commented. He said Pesach, before he started learning the teachings, before he was exposed to the teachings of Chassidus, Pesach was very uncomplicated. He says, what are we commemorating? What are we celebrating? We were slaves to a person named Parai, the king in a land called Egypt. Hashem took us out. He drowned them in the water, and that's it. Then we're free. He said, but ever since I started learning the teachings of Chassidus, I realized that Egypt is not a land. Egypt is in me. I realized that Parai is not a land, if not a person. Parai is in me. And to get rid of them is not nishta ze pashut. It's not simple at all. It's a lifetime's work. Now, what does that mean? You see, and here's the point. Chassidus says that the word Mitzrayim comes from the same root as the word Meitzarim. Meitzarim. Meitzar is a boundary, a limit, a confinement. That's what Mitzrayim is. And Yetzias Mitzrayim, leaving Mitzrayim, means to leave all forms of limitations and all forms of boundaries. So what kind of boundaries are we talking about? What are the limitations that we're talking about? The Pesach comes that we're celebrating, being freed from all limitations. So the truth is, the limits and the boundaries that we're discussing and that we're referring to are boundaries that every human being has. It is our limits, the limited and finite perspective that we have as human beings, where we look at the world around us, and we look at the sort of the rules that the world imposes and the order that the world imposes and the mentality of this world, and we're under its control. And the world gives us this feeling that we should forget sort of the closeness that we have to Hashem. Meaning, when we think of the world as balabas, as control, as in us under its control, then we forget that at all times, at every moment, Hashem is close to us, and we forget the unique love that Hashem has for every one of us. So that's really what Mitzrayim is. Mitzrayim is when we're so caught up in the worldly mentality and the worldly perspective that we forget on this unique relationship and closeness that we have with Hashem. Yetzias Mitzrayim, Pesach, is when we focus on leaving Egypt, leaving these Mitzarim, leaving these boundaries. What that means is that we were given the ability, Hashem gave us the ability to stand above all these constraints, all these limitations that the world imposes upon us, to feel close to Hashem at every time and at every place, and to realize that our closeness to Hashem is not limited to time and place, and it's always there. And that connection is above anything else, meaning nothing could get in the way. Nothing worldly, not any constraints of time, not any constraints of even our own past could get in the way of our relationship with Hashem. Yetzias Mitzrayim, we are above any such limitations. Now, in essence, this is the answer to the Maharal's question. Again, the Maharal's question being seemingly Tisha B'Av cancels out Pesach, because Tisha B'Av means that we are in Galus, and Pesach means that we are freed. So why are we celebrating Pesach in a time that we are in Galus? And in essence, the answer is because ever since Yetzias Mitzrayim, we are free. And when we say free, we mean in the true sense of the word. Free from all worldly things, all worldly perspectives, mentality, and control, because our relationship to Hashem is above that. Our closeness and really our love that Hashem has to us and we have in return is above anything else, and nothing can get in the way of that. So in that sense, ever since Yetzias Mitzrayim, it was a continuing thing, continuing till today, and weiter and beyond. So the Maharal says, the reason why Tisha B'Av doesn't cancel Pesach is because Pesach made us essentially free, regardless of the circumstance that we find ourselves, regardless of the situation that we find ourselves. Now that is where I want to go into the teachings of Chassidus on Pesach, because how do we do that? So how are we able in our lives, in the world that we live, to feel above it and feel that nothing can get in the way, and regardless of our situation, regardless of our circumstance, and as I mentioned before, regardless of our own maybe past, that we look back and we say, oh, we got ourselves in the way. The key to feel that, the way we experience Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Torah tells us, is through matzah. The reason why Pesach we eat matzah, and let's remember, by the way, the reason why the Yidden were told to eat matzah on that night too. In other words, we eat matzah not only in commemorating then, but the Yidden at that time were also told to eat matzah before they left Mitzrayim. Matzah is the key. You know, this coming Sunday is another birthday. I said the Maharal's birthday is on Pesach. This coming Sunday, Yud Aleph Nisan, the 11th of Nisan, is the Rebbe's birthday, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's birthday, and he would often quote the following Zohar. The Zohar that says that matzah, the Zohar says in Aramaic, is Michla de Mehemnusa and Michla de Asfasa. Michla de Mehemnusa is bread of faith, and Michla de Asfasa is bread of healing. You know, interesting about bread of healing, just as a beautiful anecdote, just as a side, but obviously we think about things like this nowadays especially, that the Rebbe often told certain doctors, I know a doctor in Crown Heights, if anybody here might know him, Dr. Feldman, that the Rebbe several times told him that since the Zohar says that matzah is bread of healing, he should mix matzah into some of his medications that he gives people. So it's like Maisa Nissim, you know, sometimes he would put matzah into his medication, and this would be the the trick sort of how to heal the people. Anyways, but back to the fact that matzah is the bread of michla d'meim nusa, the bread of faith. What does that mean? So I want to start with a story. The following story happened in 1945. And in 1945, obviously, 1945 before Pesach is towards the end of the war. Only if I think I'm correct about this, and only in the beginning of May is when the Nazis, the Germans, Yimach Shemam, actually surrendered. But at that point, many of the camps were already liberated, at least by the Russian army at that time. And many, many Jews found themselves already in DP camps, in displaced persons camps. Now, amongst those Jews was a Yid by the name of Eliezer Zusha Portugal. He was the Sculliner Rebbe at the time, Scullin being a city in Romania. And he was the Sculliner Rebbe before the war. And after the war, he continued being obviously the Sculliner Rebbe, but he found himself in a DP camp at that time. And, you know, it was a very difficult time. But the Jews in the DP camps had a lot of help, thankfully. A lot of provisions for Pesach were being sent by the Joint, by the UJA, by different Jewish organizations that were sending matzahs, they were sending wine, they were sending grape juice, they were sending different things to the Jews in the DP camps, so they should have, you know, at least minimally what they needed for Pesach. But the Sculliner Rebbe was not satisfied because he wanted shmura matzah. You know, just to take a brief, footnote for those who. Maybe I should clarify. Obviously, you go to the store and you could buy matzahs, Manashevis matzah, Yehuda matzah, Streitz matzah, or you could buy shmura matzah. Now, the obvious difference between shmura matzah and regular matzah is the price, right? You get a regular box of matzah, you get for $5, $6. I don't know, you know, a shmura matzah you get for $23, $24 nowadays. But it's really, and you might say it's not justifiable, but it really is because number one, shmur matzah, you'll notice, is round, where regular matzah is square, and the Torah says that ugos matzahs, we should look for round matzahs. But in addition to that, it's done by hand, handmade shmur matzah. But also the word shmura is really the key, because shmura means that it was guarded, it was watched. What does it mean, matzah that was watched? It means that the wheat and the flour of the matzah was being guarded and watched since it was harvested until it became part of matzah, until it was made into matzah, that it shouldn't get wet. Because if the wheat or the flour would get wet, then it could become chametz, it could rise, it could leaven, and then obviously it's not kosher for Pesach. So that's shmura matzah. So now they're sending over matzahs to the DP camps, and this was in the city of Chernovitz in Russia, where they found themselves in the DP camp. And the Sculliner Rebbe was not satisfied. He wanted shmura matzah. He managed to get a few bags of shmura flour that was being guarded and being watched since they were harvested. Simcha, he got these bags, and he managed to get a team together. They baked matzahs. From these bags, they made a few pounds of matzahs, shmura matzah, and he sat down and he wrote letters. He wrote letters and he sent them to all the other rabbis, the rebbes, and the leaders of different Jewish communities that found themselves in the DP camps as well. And he wrote to them that every community could send one representative to come get 3 matzahs. That's it. 3 matzahs for each community, not for each, each family. 3 matzahs, 3 shmura matzahs for each community, because that's it they had. How much could he give? So that's what he offered. And people came, rabbis came, representatives came, asking for matzahs, and everyone got 3 matzahs. It was a week before Pesach, 1945, and the Sculliner Rebbe gets a knock at the door. He goes to the door, and he sees a young man by the name of Moshe Hager. Now, this Moshe Hager, this young man, was the son of the Skver Rebbe at the time. Skver, the name Hager, the Skver Rebbe, right? The Skver Rebbe's last names are Hager. Sorry, not Skver, Vizhnitz. Sorry, Skver is actually Kaspersky. But the Vizhnitzer Rebbe at the time, I apologize. So the Hager is Vizhnitz. And Moshe Hager is standing there. He says, I'm the son of Baruch Hager, the Vizhnitzer Rebbe. So of course, who doesn't know the vision of Tzar Rebbe? And I came to pick up matzahs. So the Skolner Rebbe goes in to get matzahs. He comes out with 3 matzahs. He gives it to this young man, Moshe Hager. And Moshe Hager says, no, my father insists that I should come home with no less than 6 matzahs. 6 matzahs, why should you be different? Everyone gets 3. Why should you get 6? But he didn't argue. He felt very bad about giving more. But he's insisting. Moshe Hager, this young man, is saying, my father, you know my father, the vision of Tzar Rebbe, and he wants I should come back with 6 matzahs, not with 3. Okay, he feels a little broken about that. The Skolner Rebbe. Everyone else is getting 3. Here he's giving 6. So he gives him 6. He knows that the vision of Tzar Rebbe is a holy person. He didn't want to mess around with him. He gives him 6 matzahs. Sort of with a heavy heart. Fast forward a week, and it's the day of Erev Pesach. Okay, so that night will be the Seder. And the Skolner Rebbe is home, and once again he gets a knock at the door. And he opens the door, and once again, it's the same Moshe Hager, the son of the vision of Tzar Rebbe. And he tells him, he says, what are you doing here? You wanted matzah? I gave you matzah. What do you want? He says, no. My father asked me to ask you if you kept any matzahs for yourself. You gave out matzahs to every single community that sent, right? Everyone sent representatives, and you gave them matzahs. Did you keep, Skolner Rebbe, did you keep any matzahs for your own Seder? So the Skolner Rebbe looks down. He says, how could I? How could I keep matzahs for myself? There's such a demand, such a limited amount. Everyone wants. I wasn't able. I didn't have the heart to keep for myself. Can you imagine? The Skolner Rebbe made all these matzahs, and he gave them all out, didn't keep any for himself. So the son of the vision, Tzar Rebbe, Moshe Hager, he puts his hand out. He takes out 3 matzahs. He says, my father asked for 3 matzahs, not for him. He didn't want 6 matzahs. My father asked for 3 additional matzahs, so you, the Skolner Rebbe, should have matzahs as well. You went and toiled for everyone else. You yourself should have matzahs. Beautiful story. Now, it's more than just a beautiful story, because Chassidic teaches us that chametz and matzah are not only 2 different types of food. Chametz being leavened bread, and the matzah being unleavened dough. No, chametz and matzah are 2 different types of personalities. Chametz represents ego. Chametz represents arrogance. Chametz represents pride, selfishness. It rises like someone who has arrogance and egotistic, that their heart rises and pride, they feel great. Whereas matzah is humility. Matzah is anivus, is anava. Matzah doesn't rise. The Skolner Rebbe was not only giving matzahs, he was living matzahs. The selflessness that he had was, and the truth is, in that same story, the vision of Tzar Rebbe too. Everyone is worried about each other. It's the theme of matzah, not only the food of matzah. I once heard a beautiful story about the Belzer Rebbe. Belzer Rebbe, this is in Belz, in Poland at the time. The Belzer Rebbe, one year on Pesach, it was the night of the Seder, and he's sitting in his house, and the table is filled with family and people, and the Chassidim and people around the table who are there to join him for the Seder. But before he starts the Seder, he turns to his shamish, he turns to his gabbai, his assistant, and he says, before I start the Seder, I want to ask of you, please, could you go to Yankel the grocer and ask of him if he could please give us some of his matzahs? Yankel the grocer, why would you want Yankel the grocer's matzahs? I mean, Yankel the grocer is a nice man, Erlich Yid, but he's not the greatest, Talmud Chacham. He's not the greatest tzaddik. Why does the Belzer Rebbe want Yankel the grocer's matzahs? Okay, but the shamish, the gabbai, knew not to ask too many questions. He runs to Yankel's home. He comes to Yankel and he says, Yankel, I'm here from the Belzer Rebbe, and he asked of me to ask you if you would please give him some of your matzahs for his Seder. Yankel looks at his wife. His wife looks at him, says, our matzahs? He says, yeah, listen, you're Yankel the grocer, right? The Rebbe wants your matzahs. He says, my matzahs are very plain matzahs. You see, just to explain what I mean. Even in shmura matzah, right? I said before that shmura matzah could go for $25, right? I mean, right now you go to Aroma, you go to Glitz, you go to whatever, maybe even 25 is a bargain. I don't know about that price, 23, 24, 25. But you could also get matzahs that are $30, $40, $50. What makes a pound of matzah $50? So, for example, what's known as tanorishin. You see, every morning when they open up the bakery, the matzah bakery, the first batch of matzahs that go into the oven will be the most expensive. And they sell them for more. It's good. Tanorishin, the first ones that went into the oven, because it was the first. They swept out the oven, so there's no remnants of any previous matzah. So there's less likelihood that there would be any chametz there. So Yankel turns to the Rebbe's Gabbai, the Belzer Rebbe's Gabbai, and says, my matzahs are not like the best of the best matzahs. These are regular shmura matzahs. He said, listen, the Rebbe wants your matzah. You want to bring it yourself to the Rebbe? Bring it yourself. So Yankel takes a few matzahs. He runs to the Rebbe's house, to the Belzer Rebbe's house, and he brings it to the Belzer Rebbe. And the Belzer Rebbe says, thank you. And the Belzer Rebbe then says, Yankel, but before you leave, I want you to tell everybody the story of your matzahs. Story of my matzahs. He says, Rebbe, these are simple, plain matzahs. These are not, expensive matzahs. These are not the best of the best. He says, no. But tell the whole story. So Yankel says like this. I'll tell you the truth. A few weeks ago, this is like Purim time, I actually spent a lot of money to buy the best of the best matzahs. Tanorishin. I don't know if you ever seen this, but sometimes people pay a lot of money because they don't want to use rolling pins that were already used before. They want fresh, new rolling pins. I'm just giving you examples of how matzahs could be so expensive. So he's saying, I went and I spent a lot of money to buy the best matzahs I was able to get. And I brought it home and I kept it in a place, in a box, that it should be prepared for Pesach. He says, earlier today, Erev Pesach, my wife was cleaning the house for the Seder. She was sweeping, she was mopping. And boom, with her mop, she knocked into the box of matzahs. The box tumbled onto the floor, and all the matzahs broke onto the floor, and they all got wet. And he says, I wasn't able to use those matzahs for the Pesach Seder. In fact, as soon as I saw that would happen, I was going to yell. I was going to yell at my wife and say, you shlamaza, you shlump. What are you doing? You can't be careful when you mop with the mop. You knock into a whole box of matzahs. You destroyed all these expensive matzahs. But instead, he said, I bit my tongue, I bit my lips. I ran to the matzah bakery. They were just going to close. It was Erev Pesach, and I asked them, if you have any more matzahs to sell. They said, we have matzahs, but we don't have good matzahs, the ones that you bought before. We have simple. So that's what I bought, and these are the matzahs that I was able to buy earlier today. So the Belzer Rebbe turns to Yankel and he turns to everyone else. He says, you see, that's why I wanted Yankel's matzahs. Because Yankel didn't only get rid of chametz in his house, Yankel got rid of chametz in his heart. Chametz being anger, chametz being pride, chametz being ego. He felt like he was going to yell at his wife, but he held himself back. He was living matzah. And it's a living matzah. That's not just a matzah you buy in the store. And that's why I wanted his matzahs for our Seder tonight. And that's really, Chassidic says, how do we reach Yetzias Mitzrayim? How do we leave feeling that, sort of the world limits us in feeling close to Hashem, is through digesting the theme of matzah. Swallowing what matzah represents, living matzah. That when we put ourselves aside, and putting ourselves aside doesn't only mean our own ego and pride and arrogance, but even our own mentality that gets in the way sometimes of thinking, Azoy zok de welt. This is what the world says. This is, let's use an example of nowadays, and I don't want to get too specific, but these are the predictions. This is what they say. We have to realize that a Yid has a connection to Hashem that's above that. And our relationship to Hashem, our closeness to Hashem, and Hashem's love to us is beyond that. And no rules of teva, no rules of nature have control over us, because that's Mitzrayim. That's the boundaries and limits of this world. Yetzias Mitzrayim means that we can leave that, but in order to leave that, we need matzah. we have to put ourselves aside, realize that it's not about us. It's not about me. It's not me is chametz. Me is chametz. When it's about what I feel, what I think, what I want, that's chametz. But when we say it's about Hashem, what Hashem wants of us, and how Hashem is above everything, that's matzah. Now, I want to conclude with another story, a Chassidic story that I personally feel very relevant this year, even more than any other year. It's a story about the Chayz of Lublin. Chayz of Lublin was an incredible student of the Maggid of Mizrich. Chayz of Lublin, they call him the Chayz, the seer of Lublin, because he saw things that we ordinary people don't see. And this story, I think, is an example of what he saw that others didn't see. The story is told that the Chayz of Lublin, one Pesach morning, one year, he woke up and he turned to his students and he said, I must find Chatzkel. Chatzkel? Who's Chatzkel? I don't know who Chatzkel is, said the Chayz. Said, but I know I have to find Chatzkel. I'm able to see that Chatzkel of Lublin had the greatest Seder in all of Lublin last night. Last night, Chatzkel's Seder was the greatest Seder. And the Chayz said, not literally jealousy, but he says, I envy him. I want to know what was the secret of Chatzkel's Seder that made it the most beautiful and greatest Seder in all of Lublin. So his Talmidim, his students, the Chayz's students were very loyal, and they ran around the whole Lublin trying to find the Chatzkel. And I'll tell you, the way I read the story is that they kept on finding Chatzkels and they realized that's not who he wanted. But in any case, the point is they finally find a man, Chatzkel, who was a very simple person. Chatzkel, the water carrier. Chatzkel, he schlepped the buckets of water for people. And they bring him to the Chayz of Lublin, and the Chayz sees him and says, Chatzkel, tell me about your Seder last night. He says, I should tell you about my Seder last night, you sure? He says, please. And Chatzkel starts crying. Chatzkel can't control himself. He starts crying. He says, why are you crying? He says, why is the Rebbe embarrassing me? I'm so ashamed of my Seder last night. Why would the Rebbe do that? That I have to tell everybody? He says, Chatzkel, you have nothing to be embarrassed about. I want to just, please, just tell us, share with us, what was the story about your Seder last night? Chatzkel says, listen, I'm very embarrassed about it, but since you want, I should tell you, I'll tell you. He says, people know me, I'm a water carrier. I schlep buckets of water the whole day. The busiest day of the whole year is Erev Pesach. Erev Pesach, the day before Pesach, everyone wants water. Everyone wants water for the whole Pesach. People want water for all different needs that they have. And the whole day, from morning until Pesach, until, Shkia, I'm schlepping water, for people. And it came time last night for the Seder, and I came home. I was so oiskemuchet. I was so exhausted. I was so tired that I fell asleep. I fell so deep asleep. My wife kept on coming and saying, Chatzkel, wake up. And I couldn't get up. I was so deep. She said, Chatzkel, we have to make a Seder. It's Pesach night. I didn't even hear her. She tried again and again. And every few hours, she would come saying, Chatzkel, it's Pesach. We have to make a Seder. And Chatzkel, he just was so deep asleep, he didn't even hear her. Finally, he wakes up and he sees that it's right before the Zman. He opens his eyes, he looks around, he sees, Oy vey, it's right before the Zman, right before the end time of being able to do the Seder. And he gets up and he right away runs out, he sees Oy vey. There's no way he'll be able to do all the Simonei HaSeder, Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas, Yachatz, everything before the Zman. So he puts together 3 matzahs. He fills up 4 cups of wine. He opens up the Haggadah, Avodah Mayinu, whatever. He says, Hashem, listen, I messed up. I slept. But I want you to please accept my Seder. I'm going to try to do what's right. Do the mitzvahs of the night. Do the mitzvahs of Pesach. And I'm begging of you, please accept my Seder as if it was done properly. With that, he makes a bracha on the matzah, eats the matzah, 3 matzahs, 4 cups of wine. He reads a little bit of Haggadah. He has such a stomachache. So his head is spinning. He falls back asleep. He says, so Rabbi, you want to know the story of my Seder? That's the story of my embarrassing Seder. And the Chayz of Lublin looks at him and says, "No, Chatzkel, I know I was able to see that your Seder was actually accepted in Shemayim as the greatest Seder in all of Lublin. And I know why. Because it wasn't a Seder, you weren't trying to sort of, mimic what I did last year. How am I going to be able to keep up with all the traditions and the customs and the things that we did in my house when I was younger or did what I did the previous years? You had one goal in mind. And your goal in mind was, how could I do what the Eibishter wants? How could I do what Hashem wants of me? How could I do the mitzvahs of the Seder now properly?" That was the only agenda that you had. That was the only objective that you had in your mind. And that's why it was the greatest Seder. So I know it's not the same, but this is what I mean to say when I say that I relate to the story, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels similar to this, that this year's Pesach is going to be very strange. This year's Pesach is going to be very different, either in terms of the guests that we have or in minhagim that we do with other guests and with the grandchildren or children or family and cousins, whatever. It's a different Seder. But I guess we could have a Chatzkel Seder. What it means, not literally, but what it means a Chatzkel Seder is a Seder where our sole agenda, sole goal is that we want to do the mitzvahs of Pesach correctly. We want to relate and really, again, like swallow the theme of what matzah is. It shouldn't just be food, but it should be who we are. It should be our personality, matzah. And then we should be able to celebrate true Yetzias Mitzrayim, a Yetzia, a liberation from all constraints, all limitations, all boundaries, physical limitations, spiritual limitations, any things that are sort of getting in our way of feeling true freedom in our relationship to Hashem and our closeness to Hashem. And ultimately, as we concluded last year Pesach, last year's Seder, the Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, may we merit this year Pesach to celebrate in Yerushalayim, together with the Karban Pesach, together with all of Bnei Yisrael, physically, not only on Zoom, but physically to celebrate with all of Bnei Yisrael together. And we should have the ultimate simcha. And I want to wish everybody a chag, kosher v'sameach, a kosher and a freilichen Pesach. And we should only have gesund for you, gesund for your families. We should only come together for simchas and for happy occasions. And Ritz Hashem, when we get back to regular Seder, look forward to having a shir in person and not only on the computer. And I just want to reiterate again that I am sorry about the late start. Take care.
Chases them away.
Okay, Zeit gesund, everyone. Be well.
Take care.
Yeshkoyach. And once again, a kosher and freilich Pesach.
Maybe we should
To you
swap
also, the family.
Amen.
a fresher set. Well, you're going to have Matil come, so explain that to me.
Thank everybody for their participation. Hope that, as the Rabbi said, in future years we'll be able to share simchas together, Pesach with family as well. God kasher v'samech to everybody.
Wait, the caterpillars are coming in from the garage, you think?
Well, yeah, get out.
Oh, quite well.
Simple, but yeah.